In 1974, a show called Heidi, Girl of the Alps aired on televisions worldwide, creating an instant global sensation. Still seen as a masterpiece today, the show told the story of a young girl named Heidi, who is sent to live with her grandfather in the Swiss Alps. Here, she gets up to all kinds of adventures with Peter the goatherd, her dog Joseph, and her rich friend Clara, all while squirming her way into the heart of her grumpy old grandfather, and in turn, us, the viewing audience. If you're old enough but not familiar with the show, you probably live in either the UK or the US, two of the few places that the show didn't catch on. But across Europe, the Middle East, South America, South Africa, and Asia, this show was a huge hit. As someone who grew up in India before moving to the UK, I have incredibly fond memories of watching this show even in the 90s. And my family still nostalgizes about the days that I watched innocent shows about little farmer girls and not violent anime featuring gratuitously big boobied ladies. But what neither they, nor I, nor most of the viewing world realized at the time was that this was an anime, one of the first truly global anime. And one of the leading figures involved in its creation was a then unknown Hayao Miyazaki, who would go on to create an animation house by the name of Studio Ghibli. The creators were in fact so keen on telling this story authentically that Miyazaki himself went on a scouting mission to Switzerland and throughout Europe to make sure they depicted the environment and characters as accurately as possible.
ところがいわゆる場面設計をやった宮崎駿はですね、ただ見て回ってるんですよね。景色なり、着ている服なり、建物なり、食器なり、ただ見てる。それを彼は一生懸命記憶してハンティング取り入れた。
But why was this 1970s anime made in Japan so keen on retelling an old Swiss children's novel? I mean, the original story is from the 1800s. And why do so many anime from then till now, and especially now, with the likes of Attack on Titan, Vinland Saga, and Frieren, all seem to have such a fascination with Europe? I mean, it's not like in the West, we make loads and loads of shows set in Japan. Only the odd film or TV show here and there, and they're almost never based on retelling authentic Japanese literature or folklore. Usually, they're just white guy ends up in Japan stories. But in anime, Europe, or fictional places that are substitutes for Europe, are such a common setting that you probably didn't even think about how normalized that is until I just mentioned it. So what's going on? Where did anime's fascination and maybe obsession with Europe come from? Well, I'm about to tell you, but it's a bit of a long story, so settle in. Nowadays, when we think of weebs in the West obsessing with Japanese culture and fetishizing the allure of Japan, we often make the mistake of assuming that it's a one-way street. But Japan itself has long been fascinated with Europe too, in its own way. Before we talk about anime, we need to talk through some important historical context. For those who aren't aware, Japan went through a period of isolation from the rest of the world called Sakoku, which means closed country, and it lasted over 200 years. During this time, which spanned from the early 1600s till the 1850s, Japan didn't allow any Europeans, or generally foreigners, to enter the country, except for some limited trade with China and Korea, and one singular Dutch trading post in Nagasaki. While this was a time of great cultural growth for Japan, Sakoku ended in 1853 when the US arrived with warships and demanded that Japan open its borders, and then forced them to sign the hilariously named Treaty of Peace and Amity. After this time though, in what is known as the Meiji period, Japan once again opened its borders and set about to furiously catch pace with the rest of the world, having realized just how far they had fallen behind the Western powers. With this came an influx of technology, literature, and science into Japan, particularly that from Europe. European fashion became trendy, and European culture became a point of fascination. It is in this context that a lot of Japan's prominent media developed, particularly its films, and eventually comic books, or mangas. An easy mistake to make would be to assume that the Second World War is the cause of anime's fascination with Europe. But no evidence from any of the literature I read, and I've been researching this topic for like 2 months now, backed up that idea. It is an obvious conclusion to draw that Japan being allied with Germany would somehow make it fascinated with German culture, but if you stop to think about it just a little bit, you'll understand why it's not true. Germany didn't suddenly become fascinated with Japan after the World War. Why would it? The alliance was purely militaristic. There was no exchange of cultural ideas, and there was no time for it. There was a global conflict going on. Living in the UK, we didn't suddenly become a lot more interested in France's culture, thank God. just because we were allied in the war, nor Russia. Instead, Japanese film and media developed itself during and after the war, with animated cartoon films being used for war propaganda and also for entertainment. They were massively influenced by works from all over Europe, particularly France and Russia, but had its own style and Japanese grounding and influences too. The medium slowly evolved into the styles and aesthetics that resemble what we would now recognize as being anime. Eventually they became a commercial product, with manga being purchased by thousands of people, and with television, those stories began being converted into TV shows, which is when the boom of anime really came through in the 1960s and beyond. The 60s is when anime started to find a lot of commercial success both in Japan and abroad in the US and Europe. First with Astro Boy, which was the first anime film to be released in the US, and later in the 1970s with Space Battleship Yamato. Here's where we start to see the establishment of a certain trope that would follow in a lot of anime thereafter: the adventures of young male protagonists in conflict-oriented worlds, which we now see as a staple in shonen anime like Naruto, One Piece, or My Hero Academia. But it's actually shoujo anime where our interests lie, stories about young women targeted at a young female audience. While young boys enjoyed space operas about intergalactic war, young women in Japan were much more interested in stories about people, everyday interactions of love, jealousy, and friendship. And this is where Europe comes into the picture. Since the beginning of the Meiji period that I spoke about earlier, young women in Japan were already fascinated with European fashion and aesthetics, and early shoujo anime reflected this, the large number of them taking place in European settings. But one fascinating and surprising reason why early shoujo anime set their stories in Europe was that it allowed them to explore otherwise forbidden themes, such as homosexual love and female empowerment. As legendary critic Frederick Schodt writes, "Foreign settings create an exotic quality, with storybook scenes and fashions, and allow heroes and heroines to act in ways that are not always socially possible in Japan." A notable example of this was The Rose of Versailles, a manga which eventually got turned into an anime and is set in the French royal court, just before and during the French Revolution. Initially, the show follows the biographical story of Marie Antoinette, the last queen of France, but soon pivots to the real main and fictional character of Oscar Francois de Jauget. And this is the point I will acknowledge that I'm pronouncing words in like 4 different languages, so please forgive me if any of my pronunciations are way off. Oscar is a young woman who was raised as a boy and a soldier by her father who longed for a male heir. Oscar becomes captain of the Queen's Guard, and although she openly identifies as a woman, her masculine demeanor and androgynous aesthetic create for various gender-defying and homoerotic subplots. Oscar's first romantic intertwining, for example, is with a female character named Rosalie, who falls for Oscar after she saves her life multiple times. But Oscar rejects Rosalie's advances, stating that she wanted to be in a relationship with a man, not a woman. In shoujo anime, it was very common to explore such romantic interests between women, so much so that it had its own term, Class S relationships. These were not usually sexual in their nature, but still romantic friendships between women with intensely strong emotional bonds or admiration for one another. After this failed situationship, Oscar then encounters 2 different male suitors, one who sees her only as a man and one who sees her only as a woman, both of which prove exceedingly frustrating to Oscar, who wants to be recognized for her whole self. Eventually, Oscar falls in love with her lifelong sidekick, Andre, who is himself an androgynous figure, and by the end of the story, cuts his hair to look similar to Oscar's, and indeed, by the end of the show, they look very much alike. Oscar even describes Andre as her shadow, and the fact that they're both basically the same person is again a nod to the homoerotic elements which were a normal part of the genre. It was this ability to play with the dynamics of sex and gender which made shoujo anime so popular with Japanese girls at the time, who were able to project themselves into situations they otherwise wouldn't be in. Male homosexual love, for example, was fairly common in shoujo anime because the idea of men having sex was considered a lot more normal than thinking about the sexuality of women. On top of that, The Rose of Versailles was also politically very bold and inspiring, with the main character Oscar becoming so disillusioned with the corruption of the French aristocracy that she joins the Republican rebels and fights to overthrow the monarchy, eventually dying in battle for the cause. These progressive and transgressive messages made The Rose of Versailles so popular at the time that, according to critic Deborah Shamoun, when the main character Oscar died, teachers reportedly were forced to suspend classes because all the girl students were in tears. And one angry fan actually mailed a letter containing a razor to the artist who wrote the manga, Ikeda Ryoko. So we see here that early on in anime, Europe represented a foreign setting where characters could behave differently to what the norms in Japan allowed, while still speaking very much directly to Japanese audiences. This is a theme that would continue on in the 70s as we approach the era of Miyazaki. In the 1970s, a new type of anime subgenre began to emerge, series which directly retold traditional European stories. Heidi, the show I mentioned at the start of this video, was one of the pioneering works in this field, and was part of a larger series called the World Masterpiece Theater. This was a Japanese TV show which would take a classic piece of literature and spend a year airing it as a serialized anime. The series adapted everything from The Moomin of Finland to the British classic of Peter Pan, and although it was not originally part of the series, Heidi was later usurped as part of the wider umbrella of the World Masterpiece Theater. In almost all these series, Europe is shown as a magical, idyllic land where adventures can take place, and children in particular are at liberty to discover themselves and the world around them. And if you're wondering why this was the case, critic Cobus van Staden summarizes it well. There are very few anime depictions of contemporary Europe. Mostly, Europe is treated as a changeless Ruritania, where the use of historically European detailing and landscapes designates the setting as beautifully past. What van Staden is saying here is that for anime, Europe becomes an almost fantastical, fictional land, trapped in that era when cutesy little villages were tucked away in some lush green part of the world, away from the corruption of the modern industrial age and the evils that come with it. This also followed in the footsteps of classic European literature and the trend of Bildungsroman, which means coming-of-age stories, in the vein of what Charles Dickens wrote, where children confront a cold adult world and learn lessons meant to teach the viewing or reading audiences valuable life lessons. On top of that, the European setting allowed filmmakers to tell a different kind of story, unlike the kinds currently being told to Japanese audiences at the time in more action-oriented anime. Speaking on his time working on Heidi, Hayao Miyazaki wrote that we wanted to create a work for children that wasn't frivolous, and we wanted to break away from the compromised and slapdash television animation shows of that time. In fact, this desire was so strong that it actually ended up taking the animation company that made Heidi, Zuio Aizo, and ended up running it into the ground financially. Heidi's animators were so determined to make sure that there was lasting quality in every cell and every second of animation that they spent way more time making each episode than was the norm for the industry. Miyazaki refers to making Heidi in a year-long state of emergency, and said that it was the lessons that he learned from making the show that pushed him away from television and towards films. It was only then that we came to understand the danger of television, he writes. Television repeatedly demands the same thing. Its voraciousness makes everything banal. We realized that television required our state of emergency to become a normal condition. The only way to have a long-term relationship with television is to lower the level of production quality to one that can be sustained. Though this was obviously tragic at the time, it's also something we can perhaps be grateful for now, because it's ultimately what leads to the creation of Studio Ghibli in 1985, founded by the legendary figures of Hayao Miyazaki and Isao Takahata, who had worked together on the show Heidi. As should already be apparent by now, Miyazaki in particular had a great personal fascination with Europe and made several research trips across various parts of the continent, from Wales to Stockholm to several places in Germany. It is these varied influences that would eventually become the iconic Studio Ghibli style, which most of us can now recognize at just a glance and has influenced so many anime since. But unlike Heidi, where Switzerland was a relatively specific but rural utopia, in Ghibli films we start to see a change in emphasis. Miyazaki uses all these places that he had visited and taken pictures of and turns them into one beautiful amalgamation. For example, if we look at Kiki's Delivery Service, which is one of my favorite films of all time, we can see that the locations and architecture aren't particularly matched with any one European location. Instead, it's a mix of various European aesthetics, but also some fantastical and anachronistic elements, making it hard to place exactly where or what time period the film is supposed to be set in. The same can be said of Howl's Moving Castle, which on top of having magic, of course, also has things like gliders and various steam machinations, which have gone on to massively influence steampunk and basically create another subgenre where a vague hodgepodge Europe is often the setting. Critic Dani Cavallaro writes that this all comes from the Japanese concept of akogare no Paris, the Paris of our dreams, which refers to an elaborately fantasized Europe as seen through the Eastern eyes. This is actually quite funny because this idealization of Europe, pushed heavily by Miyazaki amongst others, has actually resulted in a specific phenomenon called Paris Syndrome, which is a term coined by a Japanese psychiatrist to refer to the cultural shock that tourists, particularly Japanese and other Asian tourists, feel when they turn up to Paris and realize that it's not at all as magical as they imagined it to be. And apparently, it can cause quite severe mental health problems. But going back to Ghibli films, we can see again the use of Europe as a fantastical, exotic setting which allows for new stories to be told. But there's also something new being done, which is that the idyllic European setting is often corrupted by the advancement of technology. Films like Howl's Moving Castle and the early Ghibli work Castle in the Sky are explicit warnings on the dangers of technology, and particularly militaristic technology. While both films start off with wholesome and idyllic settings, these are quickly destroyed and the peace ruined by people who use the fruits of human advancement for their own selfish gain. Both our main characters, Sophie and Pazu, respectively, have their lives turned upside down by these bad actors. These, of course, have strong parallels to Japan's own militaristic history. Going back to what we spoke about earlier, after the end of isolationism, once Sakoku ended, Japan rapidly rushed to both modernize its technology, but also its empire, and taking a leaf from its European influences, began to invade and conquer various parts of China and East Asia. Rather than necessarily set these films in Japan and make the message more blunt, but also more antagonizing, one possible reason for setting anime in Europe is that it allows the social critique to be more generalized and also one that is more universal. And with so much of this militaristic behavior originating from the European powers, it made added sense to tell these stories in a European setting as well. This again is a major theme that continues in the steampunk genre, where the dangers of technology are often central to the story. And even outside steampunk, the European setting can still offer a great window into those same critiques. Full Metal Alchemist, which is often listed as one of the best anime of all time, touches on these very themes. It follows the story of two brothers, Alphonse and Edward Elric, obviously Germanic names, in the fictional country of Amestris, which is clearly meant to portray a militaristic Germany. In their world, alchemy is a science which allows alchemists to transform objects from one form to another, as long as they follow the law of equivalent exchange, which is that they must provide something of equal value to transmute an object like they do. The older brother, Edward, is recruited by the government to become a state alchemist, which he hopes will allow him to conduct research on returning him and his brother to their original bodies, which themselves were lost during the reckless pursuit of scientific advancement. But the government merely uses its alchemists as human weapons for militaristic expansion, and the brothers soon learn the dark world they've been dragged into. Disturbed by what they see, they began working on ending the current regime and to fix the wrongs they see in the world. As we get closer and closer to the modern day of anime, the reasons for the European settings become increasingly diverse, as we see in examples like this. But the influences of their origins are still also very clear. Nowadays, we live in an era where the world is much more globalized and easy to access. The absolute domination of the internet over our lives and the ability to travel across the world so much more freely has done a lot to demystify Europe to Japan and vice versa. So accordingly, representations of Europe have started to become even more common, though they still follow a lot of the same inspirations we've spoken about already. Let me break down some of the different kinds. We've seen the rise of anime like the Vinland Saga, which is a beautiful exploration of violence, slavery, and the evils of war. The anime is set mostly in England and Denmark, but is also an historical account of the real events of the Danish conquering of England. It features real characters like King Canute and Thorfinn, but takes creative liberties with the specifics of their stories. The show plays with all the various traditions we've just spoken about in this video. Much like Miyazaki's works, the European setting in the Vinland Saga allows for scathing critiques of armed conflict and dehumanization, but it also deviates in that it is very much concerned with the realism of where it is set. Europe is not a fantastical, magical land, but rather a brutal and unforgiving place where murder, war, and slavery are all commonplace. There are real-world events that the story has to incorporate and stay true to, so it doesn't play loose with those aspects. In this regard, it's much more like The Rose of Versailles. It's inspired in equal parts by real Norse folklore, but also just the author Makoto Yukimura's personal fascination with the culture. So overall, we can say a show like the Vinland Saga represents the Japanese desire to tell stories inspired by the local tales of European cultures. More traditionally, we have anime like Attack on Titan, which although clearly not as wholesome as Ghibli films, is essentially following in the same tradition. It follows the same beats of the European setting being a mishmash of various European countries, with Germanic names like Eren Jaeger and the clear Nazi parallels, all the way to the Norse influences for the Titans. But But a different reason for the European setting in modern anime is actually just the exoticism of Europe. In the popular anime One Piece, for example, we have an entire arc set in the fictional setting of Dressrosa, which is an island inspired by Spain and Spanish culture. The main villain of the arc, Don Flamingo, should tell you everything you need to know just by his name, which is inspired by the Spanish epic novel Don Quixote. There's even depictions of paella and flamenco dancing. But here, we still see the general mixing of European aesthetics, with an important part of the Dressrosa arc taking place in a Colosseum, which is of course Italian in origin. So sometimes it's no deeper than just Europe being a fun and exotic place to set an anime in. Finally, we have something which is actually relatively new in terms of reasons for European influence: video games. A vast number of anime are set in a European medieval world of adventures and quests, whether that be digital, like in Sword Art Online, or real, like they are in Frieren Beyond Journey's End. This one is fairly simple to explain, so I'll keep it short, in that the reason so many video games take place in this kind of setting is that they're all drawing inspiration from Dungeons & Dragons, which is the foundational point of role-playing games, particularly video games. If you want to see that topic covered actually, I have another video I made about it here, and you'll find the link in the video description. But it's not news that video games are very popular in Japan, and so it's only natural that with the action-adventure RPG genre being so heavily set in this kind of period and aesthetic, that many modern anime would also want to explore that kind of world. This is especially true in the isekai subgenre, which is a genre characterized by the fact that the main character is suddenly transported from the boring real world to a new, often literally magical world of knights and dragons, like in the show Jobless Reincarnation, which features a protagonist who lives in modern-day Japan as an incel-type loser and is deeply unsatisfied with his life. But one day when he ends up in an accident and thinks he's died, he actually ends up waking up in a magical European world full of adventures and monsters. And here, he's given a second chance at life. And as we've established, what better setting for a second chance in a magical place than the Europe that anime loves? So this has been a long video, and an even longer personal journey for me to investigate something that's been on my mind for a long time. Namely, why so many anime are set in Europe. Ultimately, the relationship is complex and has a long history and origin, which hopefully I've done my best to elaborate on, but obviously has far more steps along the way than I have the time to get into, or even the resources to investigate. On top of that, something I haven't mentioned yet is the commercialization of anime. Ever since anime started becoming TV products and potentially sold to European markets, its relationship with Europe became obviously more involved. It makes sense that if you're making an anime and you want it to have a more global appeal, that you might set it in Europe or borrow from European aesthetics to make the show more watchable to Western audiences. But how much we should read into that is a matter of heated debate between academics. Speaking of, I want to specifically shout out the academic article by Oscar García Aranda and the mammoth book by Jonathan Clements called Anime a History, both of which were amazing resources for research for this video. And I'll be providing all my references in the video description. In my mind, there's a fairly clear line running through the development of anime's relationship with Europe, starting with the general cultural fascination amongst Japanese people, to then the use of Europe as a place for speaking on taboo topics in shoujo anime. From there it evolves to the exploration of European folk tales and children's stories, to the Ghibli model of a fantastical magical Europe, which also leads to the industrialized steampunk themes that offer a chance to make social critiques. Finally, we have the modern era, where all these influences kind of mix, and we also get the addition of video games, which bring with them their own fascination with medieval Europe in particular, courtesy of Dungeons & Dragons and other role-playing games. So there you have it. I hope you've enjoyed this video because it has truly been a labor of love. And if you have, then please like and subscribe and share this video so that it can reach a wider audience. Also, if you'd like to support me directly, head on over to the Patreon link in the video description and you can earn yourself some benefits too, like your name in the end credits. I want to thank my current patrons, my community, and my editor Priscilla, without all of whom this would not be possible. Please check out the other videos in this channel, and if you have any topics you'd like me to cover, do drop them in the comment section below. But that's it from me. Thank you for watching once again, and hope to see you very soon.